I'm here to chair this panel today. I'm a professor in enterprise engagement and impact at the University of Birmingham, and I'm co-director of City Ready, the City Region Economic Development Institute, and we work closely with regional partners here in the West Midlands. I'm also the Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Regional Engagement for the University of Birmingham. And my role is to help engage with local partners and also at the national level, particularly around government policy. So I have an interest in government policy and how government works and how research and academic work can influence that. And today's panel, I think we share an interest in what's happening in government at the moment and how it affects us. And we've got some really good speakers today who will explain their views and reflections on what's happened so far with this new government. So if I could come to Alex first.
Yep, Alex Guerin, Head of Office for Marsh in London, and a representative of the TheCityUK's Next Generation Leadership Council.
Tim.
I'm Tim Fassam. I'm the Public Affairs Director for Phoenix Group, which is the country's largest long-term saving pension company. We own Standard Life, Reassure, and a number of other brands.
Katy.
I'm Katy Hyams. I am Head of UK Public Policy for Vanguard.
And Guerin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gary Cook, and I'm Head of Policy at Lloyds Banking Group. And I do just need to give my little Birmingham factoid, which is that we started in Birmingham. We're the first ever bank in Birmingham in 1765, and we've been here ever since.
Thank you. Little factoid from me is Birmingham's got more canals than Venice, and I have researched that fact and can prove it. A lot of them you wouldn't walk on without the lighting. So the questions we've got today are going to focus on this 100 days and how do we think the government's performing and how is it helping this sector and growth within the economy. So the first question I'm going to pose to everybody, and we'll start with Gary because you. After more than 100 days, what do the new government's early words and deeds tell us about what industry should be thinking about and focusing on in 2025?
Great. So from the Lloyds Banking Group perspective, I think overall we are optimistic. I think the stability and certainty that business has been calling for some time, there is a world in which that comes through over time. And so we are optimistic about the fact that the government has highlighted growth as its primary mission, and therefore embedding that through its efforts is really critical. The second thing is we're really pleased to see financial services be recognised in the way it has, and in particular to draw out financial services as a sector strategy through the government's industrial strategy. We think that's really important for many reasons, but the most obvious of which hopefully is that gives us the chance to then engage with the government on those measures that really would mean financial services can do more, support more, and invest more across the economy and help society prosper. And then the third point, and a clearly quite apparent one after the budget, is that we are watching the balance that the government strikes with its policy measures. And in particular, we bank about 1 million businesses, and we see from our business surveys, things like the budget, they are causing businesses to have to consider their next steps. So while we're optimistic, we cannot look past the fact that things like the increases in taxes, the potential changes around workers' rights, some of those will incur some costs for some businesses. And that could, for example, affect employment plans, it could affect investment plans. And so our message and the conversation we want to have with government is a constructive one about how do we get that balance right across that shared growth objective.
Thank you.
I think that's right, that there is a clear sense that government wants to engage, wants to hear our views, the views of business. Where do we want our business to go? What do we want for our clients? How does that help support the questions around national growth? And there is a clear mandate for change. There is a clear need for the government to make change and also to be seen to be making change. And I think that's why we've had so many consultations in such a short space of time, but covering all of the different sectors of the economy, on education, on employment, housing, planning. and of course on financial services. And exactly as Gary said, financial services as almost the jewel in the crown of the economic growth picture and one of the key strands within the broader industrial economy. And the sense now is we have got our opportunity to speak. We have got the chance now to say the things that perhaps we couldn't say before, or fix the things that perhaps we did not think were fixable. And that is there in the consultations, in the recent call for evidence. I think this period will probably last for 3 to 6 months into the new year, and then it will be time for action. And all of our perspectives and our evidence and our requests will be taken together, and that is when we will see the output, and that is when we will see the legislative and the regulatory change. So I think what we should be thinking about is, what does the future look like that we want for our businesses, the future that we want for our clients?
I'd agree with a lot of what's just been said, but I'd pick out two particular elements that I think are really critical to our industry and to driving economic growth in the UK, which, as you say, is the government's primary mission. And these weren't even in the first 100 days, these were in the first 7 days, I think potentially 4 days after the election. Rachel Reeves' first major announcement was 2 reviews of the pension system to be led by Emma Reynolds, a pensions minister, previously of this parish. And these represented both change and continuity, but in, I think, a positive way. So the first is looking at pension investment. And this is something we're passionate about at Phoenix. Our chairman took a year out to be Lord Mayor of London, created or convened something called the Mansion House Compact, which was a commitment to investment in unlisted equity, so venture capital and growth private equity. And this is because we saw that actually the UK pensions industry was lagging behind similar markets in terms of the returns offered to customers, which is critically important as part of the way that we prepare for an ageing society. But it was losing out on these investment returns by not investing in assets that are also drivers of economic growth, so infrastructure, housing, venture cap, private equity. So we're delighted they're continuing on that path. They're really focused on driving scale, which is incredibly important to build the diversification that you need to do this safely. They want to shift the market so it's less price-driven, more outcome-driven. These are all really positive steps. And then secondly, they announced a review of pension adequacy, which is really going to be looking at, are we saving enough as a society? Are we looking at the minimum contributions that we require under automatic enrolment? And are they going to be enough to allow people to have the retirement that they want and need? Because actually between 2040, 2060, only about half of people under current savings rates are going to have what they need for a comfortable retirement. And so that is absolutely critical for the long-term protection of older people in this country, but will also help us double down on that growth agenda. So there's more flow, more investment coming into the UK economy.
Broadly agree with everything that's been said. I think it's fairly clear that the government have laid out their position, and through things like the Mansion House Address, the Investment Summit, the budget, it's clear what the direction of travel is. I suppose the small point of difference I would make to the rest of the panel is really our advice to clients is to start planning now for the delivery phase of those consultations. There's clearly a role for engagement through vehicles like the City UK, the call for evidence, which is open until December, but really starting to plan now for the implementation, reviewing strategies, reviewing plans, and really getting ready for hitting some of the key metrics that the government clearly want to hit. So starting that work now is going to stand you in really good stead.
Thank you. I'd agree with that. The next question, and I'll give you a factoid actually again about Birmingham in this context. So the next question is about the mission of the new government in creating economic growth. In the West Midlands, the business, professional and financial services sector is a third of the economy, it's a third of employment, and it's a third of companies. And that's a little known fact because there is such a focus on manufacturing in this region in most public policy. So with that in mind, in terms of creating economic growth, and the sector has driven a lot of the growth in this region, How do you believe the government can best use the idea of economic stability, which we haven't had in the past, to drive business confidence and continue the growth pathway that sectors have? Oh, sorry, it's Katy.
Sorry. It is important. We need that confidence in order to be able to grow that the stability and to get to that investment and to see the economic growth that we all need and that the government is absolutely calling for. There's been two key events, obviously, since the government has come to power. And these two events, I think, demonstrate what the government is really trying to juggle. It is trying to manage the fiscal inheritance that it got arriving in July, whilst also creating those conditions for growth. Now, the fiscal inheritance, they looked at managing that through the budget, and we know it was one of the biggest budgets that we've seen, huge amounts of borrowing, huge amounts being raised through taxes. Now, I don't need to tell you that that has not gone down particularly well, and there continue to be a lot of concerns raised about what that impact will be on the economy, rising prices, lowering employment rates, lowering wage growth. So that continues to play out. The second key event, this is where they are looking to create that stability and that economic growth, and that was Mansion House. And the tone to the Mansion House speech was very, very different. And it has been received a lot more warmly. It was collaborative, it was about engaging, and it was about building on what we have and creating those perfect conditions for growth. And even the EU has come out and said this is a great example of a speech, and this is what we could be looking at. And I think that's really important to note, that actually we are getting those kind of accolades from the EU. Now, obviously, we talked a lot today about the importance of financial services in the growth of the economy and in the stability. And it is important that we sort of recognise what that means, because there's a number of different strands in that, and we're all here represent the variety of different industries that make up the successful financial services industry in this country. And Vanguard is focusing on retail investments, and that is where our mission lies, and that is where we spend our time focusing, getting the best outcomes for investors. And the government is focusing on that too in the call for evidence and asking how can we increase retail engagement with investments. It is not a simple question to answer, and we heard before all of the different reasons why there are concerns about investing versus saving in cash. And from our perspective, there's sort of almost two buckets, if you like to oversimplify things, which I do, kind of friction and fear. And friction is everything that gets in the way. And some of that is regulatory, some of that is psychological. But if you think about it like this, why can I get a payday loan or invest in crypto so much more easily than I could open a stocks and shares ISA? That balance isn't right. So we need to look at how we can simplify whilst maintaining the safeguards. And that's a really important piece about getting investors in and understanding what the potential benefits could be. And fear is the other one. And again, we heard a lot about the causes of that fear. And fraud is a big problem, particularly when it comes through social media. And we know how sophisticated it can be. And there was a story about the Martin Lewis deepfake. It's sophisticated and it can pull in the most vulnerable consumers. And that is a challenge. We need the tools. We all need the tools. The regulators need the tools in order to be able to tackle that. Some of the fear is less well-founded. Some of the fear is a fear of losing capital. We have to put those big risk warnings on. Your capital is at risk. But when you look at your cash in a cash ISA or in a bank that we know has really high trust levels, you see the same number. And you know that you're going to get 2-3% every year, and that feels safe. But the risks of investing in cash are not clear, and the risks of doing nothing have not been clarified. And I think unlocking that and engaging with consumers and making the compelling case as to actually what an investment can do for you and the returns that can then feed back into the UK economy, into the UK capital markets and private markets, that is how you get that sense of improving consumer outcomes, improving economic outcomes, and that improved stability on which we can build that growth.
I think a couple of points I'd make, broadly, there's been a lot of talk about regulation. I think everyone's in favour of the secondary objective around growth and competitiveness. That's going to be a good long-term thing for economic growth in the country. I think you'll probably notice a theme with some of the things I'm going to talk about. Actually, I'm focused on, and our clients focus on, practical implementation once the rhetoric is finished. So specific to insurance, there's a consultation about onshoring a captive regime in the UK. I think on the face of it, that looks to tick a lot of the boxes that the government has set out. It offers the opportunity for us to be at the front end of innovation in the UK. It's an opportunity for a UK-wide growth industry, not just focused on the city, and it has tangible benefit for companies, clients, etc. So we welcome the consultation on that. The key point for us will be what follows that consultation and what, if this rhetoric translates into practical, measurable next steps after them.
Thanks. The next question is going to explore FDI and another sort of, I promise I've not got a fact for every question, but another fact actually is that the West Midlands was the highest performing region outside London for attracting FDI for many years. And continues to do well. However, one of the things that we do know is that those projects, although the numbers may remain broadly the same, they've got much smaller and the investments have got smaller and it's much harder to compete and win them. So in that context, in sort of international FDI, it's an important part of driving the UK prosperity is getting that investment. How do you think the government should capitalise on its recent investment summit to further drive that investment into the UK again? And it's Tim.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is a really, really critical question because this is where all of the investment rhetoric really, hits the road. And I think there are a few. I mean, the first is, as many people have said, there is a huge stability dividend, and international markets want. There is, and I will quote, this is not my language, but people talked about the UK being under a moron premium for a while in international markets because of the amount of instability in the market. That's the sort of the phrase they used in the American markets. Now we're very much in a position of political stability, whether you agree with it or not. The government has a significant majority and is going to be able to pass its legislative programme at a point where you're seeing coalitions fracturing in Germany and France. You've seen populist governments in some parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. We've got the unpredictability of a Trump presidency in the US. There is an opportunity for the UK to be a source of stability in a world that doesn't necessarily feel very stable. But what does it mean beyond that? Well, actually, their ability to set out a clear investment plan, investment pathway is going to be critical. And most obviously, that's in the space of the transition to net zero and climate investment, where actually a properly thought through, detailed UK transition plan will give investors, domestic and international, the confidence to know which technologies they can safely back, which infrastructure is going to be prioritised in what order, and to understand what that investment landscape is without the risk of chopping and changing or sudden changes to strategy depending on the political weather. And then finally, to the local point, I should say, we also have a presence and a history in Birmingham. It's in Withell, which is about half an hour's ride from here. And we're passionate about the need to geographically diversify. And part of the reason for that is that almost all productive investment is at heart place-based. It's real. It's a wind farm, it's a road, it's a house, it's a business, it's a lab. And actually ensuring that we have the right infrastructure at a local level to bring the key stakeholders together is critically important. And the real opportunity, I think, in the UK is to use unitary authorities, use the Metro Mayor's convening power and their power over a hopefully heavily reformed planning system to bring the regulators, the government, local stakeholders together to really drive investment. You've seen that in Manchester, Andy Burnham's new quarter. He's got the university in there as a keystone investor. He's got committed money to transport infrastructure. He's done pre-approved planning, and it makes it a very easy investment proposition for asset managers to consider. And by bringing the regulator into that conversation, particularly for something like an insurer, which is very reliant on capital rules, you can have the confidence that the investments are designed in a way that the regulator is comfortable with, and the risks are within their risk appetite as well. So I think that stability and then local convening is going to be really powerful in driving investment both internationally and domestically.
Well, I think the point I would add is, we've heard a lot earlier from some of the panels about the role of industry in local expertise, and industry isn't necessarily just the capital. It can be the expertise on significant infrastructure projects. If I look at something like the insurance industry, we've got reams of claims data about what can go wrong. So it's actually seeing industry as a partnership, not just a capital provider, but an expertise centre of excellence as well, and something that can contribute more to the project than just the financial backing.
Picking up on Tim's point actually about that local convening power and developing those partnerships, it leads us nicely into the next question, which is about what further policies would you like to see that helps ensure government achieves its aim to have strong partnerships with businesses? And Gary, to start.
Great, thank you. So from our perspective, I draw on three key things, partly of which get to the delivery point and what's next. So I always think about this as a triangle. So at the top, the first thing is a strategy, and it feels like we've got that coming. It feels like whether it's the industrial strategy, the FS strategy, the infrastructure strategy, we're going to have some strategy coming, and that's good, and we'll have some direction. And what that does provide us is that direction to say, okay, government, we know you're targeting doing this. This is the role the private sector could play. And if you look back to 97, this is what the new Labour government did at that point, was say we're going to run really hard at health and education. And actually the private sector got behind that at the time, and lots of investment was made into that type of infrastructure. So strategy at the top of the triangle, number one, really helpful. Number two, I would describe as cross-economy enablers, and we've touched on them all so far, and there'll be no surprises: planning, grid, and skills. So if we crack those, we, as a country, will be able to do a lot more effectively. We all probably know the stats about how much more expensive it is and how much longer it takes to deliver infrastructure projects in the UK, and how the queuing system for the grid is going through reform, which hopefully means that when your project is ready, it then gets connected and it's not a sequential queue as it currently is at the moment. So great things that we now need to see be delivered, and that should help unlock more flow. And on skills, I'd make an observation, particularly as we've talked about Birmingham and regions so much, in addition to the skills needed generally for things like net zero, the energy market, etc. We are saying to government, when you think about funding settlements for the regions and for local and regional governments, please have a conversation about the commercial capabilities and skills. And that is a reflection that we have of delivering projects, whether they be housing, infrastructure, transport, in the regions, is that having somebody the other side of the table funded that can say, yes, this represents good value and a good commercial deal for my area, for my region, is so important. And so central government recognising that and working with the regions to ensure the capacity and capability exists across the country to deliver projects is a real thing that would make a difference from our experience. And then thirdly, the bottom of the triangle is those really core, for us, deliverable mechanisms that leverage in more private capital. So the classic example that we all know is wind. That's a mature mechanism. It works quite well. Contracts for difference, we're all broadly, with some tweaks, think that's working reasonably well. Newer technologies, where potentially the risk is a bit higher, there's still some gaps in government policy. And we'd love to see gaps around things like hydrogen, CCUS be closed over time, so that as we're talking to our regional partners, particularly, for example, in the Northeast on some of these energy projects, that those long-term blended finance mechanisms exist so that we can invest alongside the public sector and deliver those projects, creating jobs and economic opportunities throughout the country.
Thank you. Final question, and then I'll take questions from the floor. So this next one is around political stability here at home. We seem to have been moving more into that. In a world that remains unpredictable, how are firms and clients preparing for both the risk and opportunities that arise from that?
Yeah, and I think in the insurance world we talk about, risk and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. And I think when you look at the world more broadly, there are some high-level risks that aren't going anywhere. And we talk to clients about things like business resilience, which is the ability to prepare for and adapt to external events. So if we look at things like COVID, if we look at things like supply chain disruption, and the potential that has with things like sanctions over the coming months, and other risks, systemic risks like cyber. So, the advice on those points really is to invest now in preparing for those events, reviewing things like business continuity plans, supply chains, and clearly there's a role in mitigating some of that through vehicles like insurance. But at a high level, those risks aren't going anywhere. So really focusing on that at a C-suite level is going to be incredibly important going forward. Specific to the UK and the rhetoric around pre-election and since, I think we undertook a UK business risk report and released the findings in October. We surveyed 2,000 UK businesses, and unsurprisingly, financial risk is right up there. And what that means to the individual business will vary. But actually in insurance, we have a well-defined framework for talking about risk. It's, what's your risk tolerance, which is your ability to take on risk on your balance sheet. And then what's your risk appetite, which is your willingness to take on risk. So actually thinking really carefully through those two key metrics can begin to put a framework around some of the things you've heard from the Chancellor about informed and strategic risk-taking. And doing that with some advice can help free up capital, can help you make sure you're allocating it in the most appropriate way. I think the other side of financial risk clearly is the failure of third parties, and trade credit insurance is a great way of being able to insulate yourself from some of that. So that would be one point. I think the second area really is around people risk, whether that's the pension reforms, whether that's national insurance, whether that's employee health and well-being. It's clear that you need a holistic strategy that addresses attraction, well-being and engagement of employees, and you can't just focus on one of those. So with all those changes coming down the tracks with the government, looking at that and taking an overarching strategic approach to that is going to be really important. So engaging on the pension reforms and thinking about what your strategy for your pension scheme is really important. What are you doing to look after your employees' health and well-being? And how does that feed into attracting employees through things like employee benefits? We all know the cost of private healthcare is going up significantly. Don't view that as a cost in isolation. Look at it as part of a broader people risk strategy. So I think those are the risks, but actually the opportunity is there for the businesses that engage on those things and have a clearly defined approach to that, because they'll be the ones that succeed through the coming years and really help build a more sustainable, more resilient business into the coming years.
Just to follow up to that in terms of questions from the floor, this is a nice question that follows on. You've described the the things that companies can do to manage their risk in effect, but what can government do to help companies take more risk to promote growth?
Yeah, and actually insurance is one area that has a reasonably good track record of working with government on public-private partnerships. So if you look at things like Pool Re, which is the government-backed terrorism pool, or Flood Re, which is the same for flooding risk in the UK, government has a role to play in engaging with industry on some of these systemic risks. And I think cyber would probably fall into that category. Government needs to engage with industry in terms of setting out frameworks for how we handle things like data, how we can work to improve the level of cyber maturity of UK PLC so that we are a more resilient country to things like attacks or just generally critical infrastructure. So I think the rhetoric from government is really good at the moment, and it's about that continued engagement once we get through the consultation phase so that we are continuing to build truly transformative partnerships, because the government have talked about wanting growth over the next 5 to 10 years and not making short-term decisions. Flood Re expires in 2039, and you're already seeing the impact on premiums and mortgages and things like that. So, taking a long-term view is exactly what government should be doing with business.
And I think it's about taking a nuanced approach to risk and an educated approach to risk. There has been a real danger that we've seen risk as a negative word. And when we were working on the Mansion House Compact, you were talking about venture capital, and they were like, well, people would go, that's really risky. You shouldn't take risk with people's pensions. And you're like, well, this is money they're locking away for 40 years in a massive pool with lots of other people. That's the best time to take risk. Well diversified, plenty of years to get the bad years to be outdone by the good. And so making sure we're smart about where risk is appropriate and we don't end up with a sort of perfect being the enemy of the good. And one area, we've seen positive statements from the Chancellor and from the regulators. And I'm not just saying this because the regulator's in the room, but the work that the FCA has done on targeted support is a real step forward in terms of a sensible attitude to risk when it comes to helping people. Financial advice is a great product. Full financial advice, gold standard, 1 in 10 people get it. And so that is a proper example of the perfect being the enemy of the good. Something that tells you what people like you do, that isn't the best possible thing to do, but is certainly a lot better than doing nothing, creates an opportunity for so many more people to get more help. So I think the more things we can do where we're smart about what is the appropriate level of risk, I think the better.
Earlier on, you talked about the partnerships, and you mentioned Manchester and Andy Burnham forming that driving factor that pulls all the soft skills of mayors. Question from the audience around the complex nature of the structures within the UK. You've got devolved nations, you've got mayoralties, you've got unitaries at the moment, and you've got a very complex structure. Is there anything does that create a challenge or an opportunity for government, and how will it affect how they deliver on their missions, do you think?
I mean, there's certainly challenges of complexity. If you're a small growing business, there's a very large number of different organisations that you can engage with that offer different services. So some degree of rationalisation is probably sensible. But I think the real opportunity is within the devolution agenda, and actually is taking more power down to a local level where they are going to be able to make the best decisions for their areas. And that's going, we're seeing, as well as financial devolution, additional devolution over things like transport infrastructure, also skills, because you are going to have, your skills need is going to be different depending on your area, depending on what your local business community is, depending on your age profile that you have in your area. So the more power, the more decisions we can have being made at a local level, I think the more likely it is that's going to lead to a successful local growth. It's then how that reflects back up to the more senior, the national level, where you can get access to those nationally available services, nationally available support, be that something like the National Wealth Fund, which could be providing guarantees. If we get that plumbing, if you like, working between decision making at a local level and support at a national level, I think that could be really powerful.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you go first.
Sorry, thank you. I mean, I agree with that, and I was just thinking as Tim was talking, Vanguard opened its Manchester office just over a year ago, and one of the reasons that we went to Manchester was because of the higher education institutions that are there, and I know earlier it was mentioned about what a valuable asset they are, and they really are, and actually Manchester has got a very high, I don't think this is the official word, but stickiness. So a lot of the students, the graduates will stay there, and actually that's a huge talent pool. And then when you add kind of Liverpool and Leeds onto that, you've got an incredible wealth of very highly educated professionals that can work. But one of the absolute key criteria was that it could be, the transport links were good. And this is exactly the role of national government. We need those transport links. And anyone that came down to Birmingham yesterday will, have witnessed actually that sometimes a little bit of rain and wind, and those transport links really do show their weaknesses. So the cities, the devolved nations, the smaller economies within the UK, they are thriving and they have got an incredible ecosystem, but we have to link them up in order to be able to get the most out of them. And I think that is exactly the point, is that we can see the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and I think that we really need to start focusing on that.
And if I may just add, in our experience, where we've seen this work really well and the opportunity be harnessed is where we think about the opportunity for an area as a whole in the round, which is the opportunity that devolution presents. So rather than, and we do all of this of course, but rather than thinking about one site for housing or one site for a retail outlet, actually thinking about what's the vision for an entire geographic area, wrapping together housing, transport, the commercial opportunities as well, and then bringing in your commercial partners, like some of this panel here, to make that happen over a period of time. Because not only actually does that deliver greater impact, but it becomes more commercially viable, actually, if you're doing things at scale, and some costs get absorbed somewhere else in brownfield land, but actually that's offset because you're doing a bigger project in the round where something's cheaper over there. So that's the opportunity as we see it, is to do some of these things at real scale and to have a real impact for those communities.
A question again from the floor, actually, and we've mentioned a lot of the things that have come out for government, a lot of consultations, a lot of activity, and there's sort of a lot of initiatives and strategies being developed. And as Alex said, it's what do you do when the rhetoric stops and how do we deliver? Do we think that there is enough capacity in the system to be able to handle and deliver all these opportunities? Katy, seems you're smiling.
It's a great question, and I don't know whether the question is there the capacity at the level of industry or is there the capacity at the level of government? Because I think they're two different but both equally valid and important questions. I can't speak for the capacity at the governmental level, but my question at that level would be, is there enough coordination, or what is the coordination like between the different public bodies to work together and to deliver all of this change? Because it is significant, and there is a huge amount of BAU already. So how is that challenge going to be managed? So that would be my question back. I think at the industry level, that is a really, really good question, because one of the challenges I think that we have is actually the compliance burden that exists already. We have excellent, very robust regulatory framework. We need it. We need to have that consumer confidence, but maintaining compliance with it is a significant burden. And to then introduce these regulatory change programs, or these commercial programs, that's additional work. And it is going to be significant. And I think that as we move forward, we need to look at where we can create areas of simplification in order to be able to continue driving our businesses forward.
Any other comments? In terms of sort of reflections then on the panel, I think from my point of view, it's been quite useful and interesting to think about some of the challenges that I think this government will have going forward and what that might look like. And I think some of the key things that I take away from this discussion is the importance of partnership and how business can work well with government at all levels, from national down to the local, and how important that is to understand how we can invest in and drive infrastructure to attract FDI, to create the digital infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, etc. And these are all things that I think are all very prominent on everybody's minds. The question is, going back to what was said earlier, is what do we do when the rhetoric ends? And I think planning from both the local partnerships, from national government, and from business is important as we go through this next stage. And thank you to the panel.
Thank you very much.